He already had plans for Oakridge Manor as if it were his. "She's becoming a burden with this illness," my husband Richard whispered to his brother when they thought I couldn't hear. "Once I inherit the estate, we'll finally modernize it the way I've always wanted." Their inheritance. I was still very much alive despite my diagnosis, so I made a decision that would change everything. I quietly donated the entire estate to the Cancer Research Foundation that had given me hope. What happened next surprised everyone, especially me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never expected betrayal to sound so mundane, like casual conversation over coffee. But that's how it happens. Not with dramatic confrontations or tearful admissions, but with quiet words never meant for your ears. For most of my life, I was Veronica Harrington, respected literature professor at Westmore University, Richard's devoted wife of 32 years, and the somewhat reluctant heir to Oakridge Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate that had been in my family for 4 generations. The manor, with its 12 bedrooms, extensive gardens, and historical significance, had always been both a blessing and a responsibility. My great-grandfather, Judge Samuel Calloway, had built it in 1897, and it had passed through the female line ever since, carrying with it the expectation that it would remain in the family. Richard had always been fascinated by the manor, more so than I ever was, truth be told. Where I saw endless maintenance and the weight of history, he saw status and potential. "Imagine what we could do with this place," he'd say, sketching out renovation plans I would gently file away. My attachment was sentimental, not aspirational. I loved the creaking floorboards, the slightly uneven door frames, the way sunlight filtered through the original stained glass in the afternoon. The imperfections told our family story. We'd never had children, a regret that had softened but never quite disappeared over the years. Richard's medical practice had consumed his early career, and my academic pursuits had filled my days. By the time we seriously considered starting a family, fertility issues made it difficult. We became godparents to my best friend Caroline's son Lucas instead, and I poured my maternal instincts into my students, following their careers long after they left my Victorian literature seminars. At 64, I had planned a quiet retirement, finally writing the book on female Gothic novelists I'd been researching for decades, traveling to literary landmarks Richard had little interest in seeing, perhaps teaching the occasional seminar when former colleagues asked. I had neatly wrapped decades of lecture notes, donated most of my academic library to promising students, and was settling into the rhythm of days measured by my own interests rather than university schedules. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 3 ovarian cancer. The words fell like stones in the elegant office of Dr. Abernathy, who had once been Richard's colleague before specializing in oncology. Richard held my hand as the doctor explained treatment options, survival rates, clinical trials, a vocabulary I would become fluently conversant in over the coming months, but which then sounded like a foreign language I had no desire to learn. "We caught it later than ideal," Dr. Abernathy said, his kind eyes meeting mine. "But you're otherwise healthy, and there are promising treatments. The Meadowbrook Cancer Center has an excellent team." Richard was supportive at first, driving me to appointments, researching treatment options, joining online support groups for spouses of cancer patients. He rearranged his semi-retired schedule at the practice to accommodate my needs. Friends marveled at his dedication. "He's always been so independent," Caroline remarked after bringing dinner one evening. "It's wonderful to see how he's stepped up." I was grateful, truly, even as exhaustion from chemotherapy overtook me as my carefully cultivated garden went untended as I lost the hair I'd always been vain about. I felt fortunate to have a partner navigating this with me. We had promised, in sickness and in health, all those years ago. But until illness arrives, Those remain just beautiful words spoken on a perfect day. The change was gradual. First came the impatience, small sighs when I couldn't keep food down, tight smiles when I couldn't remember conversations we'd had just hours before, a common side effect of what patients called chemo brain. Then the increasing absences, board meetings that ran late, golf games that couldn't be rescheduled, visits to his brother Edward's home in North Haven that stretched from one night to 3. "You should rest anyway," he'd say, kissing my forehead, before leaving. "Edward and I have some business matters to discuss." I tried not to feel abandoned. After all, caregiving is its own burden, and Richard had always been a man who needed his independence. My friend Caroline filled the gaps, staying with me during particularly difficult days, bringing soup I couldn't eat but appreciated anyway, reading aloud when my eyes were too tired to focus on the page. Then came the morning that changed everything. I had been feeling stronger, the latest treatment showing promising results. Dr. Abernathy had even used the word responding with a smile that conveyed cautious optimism. For the first time in months, I felt well enough to move around the house, without constant rest. Spring had arrived, and I longed to at least sit in the garden I'd once tended so carefully. Richard didn't know I was awake. He and Edward were having coffee in the sunroom that overlooked the back gardens, their voices carrying through the partially open French doors as I made my way slowly down the hallway. "The oncologist seems encouraged," Edward was saying. "That's good news, isn't it?" Richard's sigh was heavy, weighted with something I couldn't immediately identify. "Yes and no," he said, his voice lowered. "She's responding to treatment, but the prognosis is still uncertain. And honestly, Ed, she's becoming a burden with this illness. The constant care, the emotional needs, the way everything revolves around treatment schedules and side effects." I froze, my hand on the wall for support. "That's rough," Edward replied. "But it's what you signed up for with marriage, isn't it? For better or worse, sickness and health, all that." "Easy to say when you're not living it," Richard said, a sharp edge to his voice I rarely heard. "And there's Oakridge to consider. Once I inherit the estate, we'll finally modernize it the way I've always wanted. Turn the East Wing into that wellness retreat concept we discussed. But everything's on hold now. Could be months, could be years." My breath caught. My husband of 3 decades wasn't just tired of caring for me. He was waiting for my death to claim his inheritance. Planning for it. Perhaps even hoping for it, though I couldn't bear to complete that thought. I retreated silently to my bedroom, my legs barely carrying me back up the stairs. The betrayal wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the casual way they were spoken, as if his renovation plans and my existence were obstacles of equal inconvenience. That afternoon, while Richard was at his weekly hospital board meeting, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first call I made was to my attorney, Sylvia Goldman. We'd been classmates at Radcliffe before she chose law and I pursued literature. She had helped my mother settle the Oakridge inheritance when it passed to me 15 years ago. "Veronica, it's good to hear your voice. How are you feeling?" Sylvia's concern was genuine. She'd sent thoughtful care packages throughout my treatment. "Better than expected, actually," I said, surprised to find it was true despite the morning's revelation. "But I need to discuss some changes to my will, privately." "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I can come to you if that's easier. Tomorrow afternoon?" The second call was to Dr. Emily Chen at the Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation. I'd met her during my treatment, a brilliant researcher whose clinical trial had given me a chance when standard protocols failed. Her work focused on early detection methods that could save countless women from discovering their cancer at advanced stages like mine. "Mrs. Harrington, what a pleasure," she said warmly. "Your last test results were encouraging." "Thanks to your work," I replied. "I'm calling because I'd like to discuss a potential donation." After both calls, I sat in the bay window of my bedroom. the one overlooking the ancient oak tree that had given Oakridge its name. The tree had weathered countless storms over its centuries, losing branches but growing stronger at its core. I felt a kinship with it now that I never had before. Richard returned home bearing takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant, a peace offering, though he didn't know what for. I accepted it with a smile that revealed nothing of my plans or the knowledge I now carried. We ate in the sunroom where he had betrayed me hours earlier, the irony not lost on me as he detailed a hospital board conflict with animation I hadn't seen him direct toward me in months. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of Richard's words pressed against my chest more painfully than any physical symptom. 32 years of marriage. How many of those years had I been his wife, and how many had I been Oakridge's caretaker in his eyes? Had he ever loved me more than what I represented? Status, security, an eventual inheritance? I thought back to our early years, when we'd lived in a modest apartment near the university. Richard had been building his medical practice, taking extra shifts, to establish himself. I was an assistant professor then, passionate about introducing students to the works of the Brontes and Mary Shelley. We'd been happy in our small space, dreaming together on our tiny balcony. When had property and possessions become more important than partnership? The morning light brought clarity. For months, my life had narrowed to survival. Doctor appointments, treatment protocols, medication schedules. Cancer had reduced me to a patient, and apparently to Richard, a burden. But I was still Veronica, still a woman with agency, with choices, with the power to determine what legacy I would leave. Sylvia arrived promptly at 2 the following afternoon, her efficient manner unchanged since our college days. Richard was at his weekly golf game, a routine he'd maintained despite my illness. For his mental health, he'd explained. So, Sylvia said once we were settled in my study, legal papers spread between us. You mentioned changes to your will. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I want to remove Richard as the primary beneficiary of Oakridge Manor and my estate. Sylvia's eyebrows raised slightly, the most dramatic reaction she ever allowed herself professionally. I see. And who would you like to name instead? The, Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation. Specifically Dr. Chen's early detection program. Sylvia nodded, making notes. The entire estate? It's substantial, Veronica. The manor alone is worth several million, not to mention the investments and other holdings. I'm aware, I said. I'd like to establish a named research center, the Calloway Center for Women's Cancer Research, after my mother's family name. There are tax advantages to charitable donations, Sylvia said, ever practical. But what about provisions for Richard? As your husband, he could contest the will if he feels inadequately provided for. I had considered this. I'll leave him the summer house in Vermont and a reasonable allowance from my personal trust. He can't claim I left him nothing, but Oakridge and the bulk of my estate will go to Meadowbrook. And you're certain about this? Sylvia asked, her professional tone softening. This is a significant change, Veronica. I heard him yesterday, I said quietly, talking to his brother about what a burden I've become, about his plans for Oakridge once I'm gone. After 32 years, he's waiting for my death to claim his inheritance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sylvia's face darkened with anger on my behalf. I'm so sorry, Veronica. Don't be, I replied. It's clarifying in a way. For months I've focused on surviving. Now I'm thinking about living, and about what I want my legacy to be. Over the next 2 hours, Sylvia and I restructured my will. The process was both painful and liberating. Each decision, each signature, was an affirmation that my life, and my death, whenever it came, would have meaning beyond what Richard had reduced it to. How do you want to handle this with Richard? Sylvia asked as she gathered her documents. These changes won't be public until the will is executed, but I'm not going to tell him, I said. Not yet. I need time to consider my next steps. After Sylvia left, I walked through Oakridge with new eyes. The portrait gallery where generations of Calloway women gazed from ornate frames, the library where I'd spent countless hours lost in beloved books, the gardens my grandmother had designed with such care. Each space held memories that Richard could never truly appreciate or monetize, despite his plans. For dinner that evening, I felt well enough to prepare a simple meal myself, something I hadn't done in months. Richard commented on my improved color, the new energy in my movements. Dr. Abernathy must be right about your progress, he said, pouring himself a second glass of wine. Perhaps we should think about planning that trip to London we've discussed. For years. Once you're stronger, of course. Perhaps, I replied noncommittally, though I've been thinking more about legacy lately than travel. Legacy? Richard looked up, suddenly interested. You mean Oakridge? Among other things, I said. Cancer has a way of clarifying what matters. Of course, he said, reaching for my hand across the table. But let's focus on your recovery first. Everything else can wait. The irony of his statement, given what I'd overheard about his impatience for his inheritance, nearly made me laugh. Instead, I squeezed his hand gently and changed the subject to safer territory. That night, I added a new entry to the journal I'd been keeping since my diagnosis. Today, I reclaimed my power. For months, I've seen myself through the lens of illness, weakened, dependent, diminished. Then, through Richard's eyes, a burden, an obstacle to his ambitions. But today I remembered who I am. A Calloway woman, the guardian of a legacy larger than one marriage or one lifetime. Whatever time I have left, whether months or years, will be lived on my terms, not as an apology for my existence. The following morning, I called Dr. Chen to schedule a meeting about my donation plans. The excitement in her voice when I outlined my intentions confirmed I was making the right choice. Oakridge would serve a greater purpose than becoming Richard's vanity project. It would help save women's lives. As spring progressed into early summer, my health continued to improve. The experimental treatment was working better than anyone had anticipated. With each promising scan, each good report, I felt not just physically stronger, but emotionally more resolved. Richard noticed the change in me, but misattributed it to my improving health. You seem more like yourself, he commented one evening, as we sat on the terrace. I've missed this version of you. I smiled, thinking how little he knew me if he believed this calm determination was a return to who I had been before. Cancer and betrayal had forged something new in me, a clarity about what I would and would not accept in my remaining time. I've missed her too, I said simply, watching the sunset bathe Oakridge's gardens in golden light. The estate had never looked more beautiful to me than it did now, knowing it would serve a purpose worthy of its history. My meeting with Dr. Chen was scheduled for a Tuesday when Richard would be occupied with his hospital board duties. I didn't want to explain where I was going or why. The less he knew about my plans, the better. The Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation occupied a modern building on the university medical campus. Unlike the clinical treatment centers with their atmosphere of quiet anxiety, the research wing buzzed with purposeful energy. Young scientists moved between labs, research assistants carried tablets filled with data, and the walls displayed enlarged microscopic images of cells, beautiful in their complexity despite their potential for devastation. Dr. Chen met me in her office, a surprisingly warm space filled with plants and photographs of her team at various conferences. A small Buddha statue sat on her desk alongside scientific journals, and a framed picture of what I assumed was her family. Mrs. Harrington, thank you for coming, she said, rising to greet me. At 40, Emily Chen had already made significant contributions to ovarian cancer research. Her compassion matched her brilliance, a rare combination in the competitive field of medical research. "Please call me Veronica," I said as I took a seat. "And thank you for making time. I know how busy you are." "Never too busy for someone who's benefited from our work," she smiled. "And I understand from our call that you're interested in supporting the foundation?" "More than supporting," I said, opening the folder Sylvia had prepared for me. "I want to donate Oakridge Manor and establish a research center focused on early detection methods for women's cancers." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from polite interest to astonishment. "Oakridge Manor? The historic estate in Highfield?" I nodded. "It's been in my family for generations, but I believe it could serve a greater purpose now. The property includes 12 acres, the main house with over 20 rooms, and several outbuildings that could be converted to research facilities." "That's extraordinarily generous," she said carefully. "May I ask why?" I hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing personal matters with relative strangers. But something about Dr. Chen's direct gaze invited honesty. "My husband sees me as a burden. Since my diagnosis," I said simply. "He's waiting to inherit Oakridge when I die. I'd rather see it used to prevent other women from facing what I have." Dr. Chen nodded, no judgment in her expression. "I understand. Many of our most significant donors come to us after personal experiences with cancer, their own or a loved one's. But a gift of this magnitude would be transformative for our research." She pulled out a tablet and opened a presentation. "Our early detection program has shown promising results, but we've been limited by funding constraints. With the resources your donation would provide, we could expand clinical trials, develop new screening protocols, and potentially create a blood test sensitive enough to detect ovarian cancer in stage Y, when the survival rate is over 90%. As she outlined the research possibilities, I felt a growing certainty that this was right. Oakridge would become not just a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future, a place where science could advance to save women like me from late-stage diagnoses. "How would the process work?" I asked. "Legally and practically?" "Our foundation has experience with property donations," Dr. Chen explained. "We would work with your attorney to structure the transfer in the most advantageous way, both for the foundation and for any tax considerations you might have. As for the property itself, we would need to assess it for conversion to research facilities, though we would preserve its historical character. And the timeline? That depends partly on your wishes. Some donors prefer to establish what we call a living legacy, where they participate in the development of the project. Others arrange for the transfer after their passing. I'd prefer the former," I said decisively. "Whatever time I have left, I want to see Oakridge begin its new chapter." Dr. Chen looked at me thoughtfully. "Your prognosis from Dr. Abernathy is encouraging, from what I understand. The experimental treatment has shown remarkable results in your case." "Yes," I acknowledged, "but cancer teaches you not to take time for granted. I want to move forward with this while I can." We spent the next hour discussing details: how the Manor's library could become a conference center, how the East Wing might house laboratories, how the gardens could remain both beautiful and functional with medicinal plant research. Dr. Chen's vision aligned with mine in unexpected ways. She too believed in honoring history while creating something new. As our meeting concluded, she walked me to my car. "This is a profound decision, Veronica. Please know that if you proceed, we will honor both your gift and your family's legacy." "I believe you will," I said, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Sylvia Goldman, my attorney, will contact your legal team this week to begin the process." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Driving home from Meadowbrook, I took a detour through Highfield Village, the charming town that had grown alongside Oakridge over the centuries. My great-grandfather had helped establish the town library. My grandmother had founded the Historical Society, and my mother had served on the town council. The Calloway family was woven into the community's fabric. I parked near the village green and walked to Emerson's bookshop, a beloved institution owned by my former student, Abigail Emerson. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and Abigail looked up from the register with surprise and delight. "Professor Harrington! What a wonderful surprise!" She came around the counter to embrace me gently. "You're looking well." "Better than expected," I admitted. "And please, it's Veronica now. You haven't been my student for 15 years. "Old habits," she smiled. "Can I get you some tea? I just brewed a pot." We settled in the shop's reading nook, surrounded by shelves of carefully curated books. Through the window, I could see the village green where seasonal festivals had marked the rhythm of local life for generations. "I've been meaning to visit," Abigail said, pouring Earl Grey into delicate cups. "But Caroline mentioned you weren't up for many visitors during treatment." "It was a difficult time," I acknowledged, "but things are looking more promising now." "I'm so glad to hear it. We were all worried." She hesitated. "Richard stopped by last month to pick up some books you'd ordered. He seemed stressed." "Caregiver." "Fatigue," I said neutrally. "It's been challenging for him." Abigail nodded, though something in her expression suggested she might have observed more than she was saying. She had always been perceptive, one of my most insightful students. "Actually," I said, changing the subject, "I'm considering a project that might interest you. A new use for Oakridge that would honor its history while serving a meaningful purpose. As I outlined my plans to donate the estate to the Meadowbrook Foundation, Abigail listened with growing enthusiasm. "That's brilliant, Veronica. Absolutely brilliant. Your mother would have approved completely." "Do you think so?" I asked, genuinely curious. My mother had been the one most concerned with preserving family traditions. "Without question," Abigail said firmly. "Isabel Calloway believed in service above all. Wasn't her motto, 'To whom much is given, much is required'? This embodies that perfectly." Her validation warmed me. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone familiar with Oakridge's history to affirm my decision. "There's something else you should know," Abigail added, lowering her voice slightly, though we were alone in the shop. "Richard was in here with his brother a few weeks ago. They were discussing renovation plans for Oakridge. Quite extensive changes. When Edward mentioned it seemed premature, Richard said something about being prepared for the inevitable." My teacup froze halfway to my lips. "I see." "I wasn't going to mention it," Abigail said, looking troubled. "But with what you're planning, I thought you should know that they seemed quite advanced in their thinking." "Thank you for telling me," I said, setting down my cup. "It confirms I'm making the right decision." Walking back to my car, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. Richard's betrayal went deeper than I'd realized if he was already consulting with architects or designers. The wellness retreat he'd mentioned to Edward was clearly more than an idle thought. That evening, Richard returned home later than usual. He smelled faintly of scotch. Not drunk, but relaxed from an after-work drink. "Sorry I'm late," he said, kissing my cheek. Board meeting ran long, then Edward insisted on a quick drink. "No problem," I replied, wondering how many other times his explanations had been partial truths. "Did you eat? There's soup in the fridge." "Already grabbed something." He loosened his tie, studying me. "You look energetic today. Where did you go?" "Caroline mentioned she stopped by, but you weren't home." "Just some errands," I said vaguely. "And I visited Abigail at the bookshop." "Ah, your star student." He smiled, but something calculating flickered in his eyes. "She mentioned my visit with Edward?" "She did," I admitted, seeing no point in lying. "Something about renovation plans. For Oakridge?" Richard sighed, sitting beside me on the sofa. It wasn't what it sounded like, Veronica. Edward's been pestering me about investment opportunities. I was humoring him. By planning changes to a house that isn't yours? His expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into concerned affection. I was thinking of us, of course. How this place could be more manageable for you during your recovery. Less maintenance, more modern amenities. The ease with which he lied struck me like a physical blow. After 3 decades together, I'd believed I knew this man completely. Now I wondered if I'd ever really known him at all. That's thoughtful, I said, matching his insincerity with my own. But I'm quite attached to Oakridge as it is. Of course you are, he said soothingly. It was just talk. Nothing serious. Later that night, I added another entry to my journal. The most painful discovery isn't Richard's betrayal, but my own blindness. How long have I been married to a man I didn't truly know? How many decisions that I attributed to love were actually calculated for gain? There's no point in confrontation or recrimination now. My path forward is clear. Oakridge will serve a purpose greater than either of us, and I will reclaim whatever time I have left as truly my own. The following morning, I called Sylvia to accelerate our plans. Over the next week, Sylvia orchestrated a flurry of legal activity, working closely with Meadowbrook's counsel to structure the donation. The Vermont summer house would remain with Richard, along with a monthly stipend from my family trust, enough for comfort but not luxury. The bulk of my estate, including Oakridge Manor and my investment portfolio, would establish the Calloway Center for Women's Cancer Research. We need to consider timing, Sylvia advised during one of our meetings in her downtown office. The transfer can be immediate, or we can arrange for it to take effect upon your passing. Immediate, I said, without hesitation. I want to see this happen. Sylvia nodded, making notes. That's what I expected you'd say. There are tax advantages to an immediate charitable donation of this magnitude, but it will mean significant lifestyle changes. You and Richard would need to relocate. I understand. The thought of leaving Oakridge created a momentary pang. Despite my determination, the manor had been my home for most of my adult life. Every corner held memories. Dinner parties in the formal dining room, quiet evenings reading in the library, spring mornings in the garden. Where would you go? Sylvia asked. I haven't decided yet, I admitted. But I'll need to tell Richard. Soon. I can't simply present him with a fait accompli. You don't owe him that much consideration, Sylvia said, a rare glimpse of her personal feelings breaking through her professional demeanor. Perhaps not, I agreed. But I do owe it to myself to handle this with integrity. Whatever Richard has become, I won't let his actions determine who I am. That evening, as Richard and I prepared for a charity gala, my first formal event since beginning treatment, I watched him adjust his bow tie with practiced movements. Once, I had found his meticulous attention to appearance endearing. Now, I saw it as emblematic of his concern with appearances over substance. You're sure you're up for this? He asked, catching my reflection in the mirror. We can still cancel if you're tired. I'm looking forward to it, I said, fastening my mother's pearls around my neck. Dr. Abernathy said social engagement is important for recovery. If you say so. He turned, eyeing my black evening gown with clinical assessment. You've lost too much weight. The dress hangs differently. Cancer tends to do that, I replied dryly. But Dr. Chen's treatment protocol has helped. I'm regaining my strength. Chen? I thought Abernathy was managing your care. He is, but the experimental protocol is Dr. Chen's research at Meadowbrook. I've become quite impressed with their work. Richard nodded absently, his attention already shifting to the evening ahead. The Andersons will be there tonight. William's interested in joining the hospital board. I should introduce you. The Westmore Medical Center annual gala transformed. the city's historic botanical gardens into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers hung from tree branches, white-clothed tables dotted the manicured lawns, and a string quartet played near the Victorian conservatory. As a board member's wife, I had attended this event for decades, but tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the knowledge that I was now living on borrowed time, both medically and in terms of the secret I kept from Richard. Colleagues greeted Richard warmly, expressing delight at my improved appearance. "Veronica, you look marvelous," said Elizabeth Winters, the hospital's chief of surgery. "We've all been so concerned." "Thank you," I replied. "The experimental treatment at Meadowbrook has been remarkably effective." "Meadowbrook?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize you were participating in one of their trials. They're doing groundbreaking work in women's cancers." "Indeed they are," I agreed. "Their research deserves more support." Richard steered me away with a hand on my elbow. "Let's not bore everyone with medical details. The Andersons are over by the fountain." As we made our rounds, I observed Richard in this social environment with new awareness. He worked the room masterfully, smoothly transitioning from medical discussions with colleagues to financial conversations with donors. Everyone knew him as Dr. Harrington, respected cardiologist and hospital board member, the charming husband caring for his ill wife. No one saw what I now did, the calculation behind his smile, the way his attention lingered on influential guests while dismissing those with less social capital. Had he always been this way, or had I simply not wanted to see it? During dinner, seated at a table with other board members and major donors, the conversation turned to philanthropy. "The Morgan Foundation just donated $10 million to the Children's Wing," announced Harold Peterson, the hospital's development director. "Largest gift in our history." "Impressive," Richard murmured, cutting into his steak. "Though I've always found named hospital wings somewhat ostentatious. Charitable giving should be more discreet." I nearly choked on my water. Richard, who had spent countless evenings discussing how to maximize recognition for our smaller donations, suddenly advocating for modesty. "I disagree," I said, surprising even myself with my directness. "Legacy giving deserves recognition. It inspires others and creates lasting impact." Richard stared at me, clearly startled by my contradiction in this public setting. "I couldn't agree more, Mrs. Harrington," said Catherine Morgan, whose family had made the donation under discussion. "My late husband believed that visible philanthropy encourages a culture of giving. That's why we wanted the Children's Wing to bear the family name." "A lovely tribute," I said sincerely, "and the impact on pediatric care will be transformative." "Exactly. Our hope," Catherine smiled warmly at me. "Perhaps we could have lunch sometime? I'm always interested in connecting with others who understand the importance of meaningful philanthropy." "I'd like that very much," I replied, ignoring Richard's increasingly rigid posture beside me. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and strained smiles. In the car heading home, Richard's displeasure finally surfaced. "What was that about with Catherine Morgan?" he asked tightly. "Since when are you so interested in ostentatious charitable giving?" "Since I realized how much good it can do," I replied calmly. "The Morgan Children's Wing will save lives." "And you need a lunch date to discuss that?" His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You've barely had energy for our social obligations, and now suddenly you're making plans with Catherine?" "My energy is returning, and yes, I'd like to explore more meaningful philanthropy." Richard fell silent, but I could feel his confusion and irritation filling the car. We had reached a crossroads I hadn't anticipated facing quite so soon. The carefully built facade of our marriage was developing cracks that neither of us could ignore. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I reflected on what came next. The legal documents for the Oakridge donation were nearly complete. Soon, I would need to tell him everything, that I had heard his conversation with Edward, that I knew he saw me as a burden, that his inheritance plans would never materialize. The thought brought less anxiety than I expected. Whatever his reaction, anger, bargaining, perhaps even genuine regret, I was prepared. Something fundamental had shifted in me since that morning in the sunroom. Cancer might have weakened my body temporarily, but it had strengthened my resolve. The next morning, Richard left early for a conference in Chicago. "I'll be back Sunday night," he said, kissing my forehead distractedly. "Caroline said she'd check on you. Call if you need anything." "I'll be fine," I assured him. "Safe travels." As his car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a weight lift. 3 days without pretense. 3 days to finalize my plans without his watchful presence. I called Caroline immediately. "Are you free for lunch? There's something important I need to discuss." Caroline arrived promptly at noon, her expressive face showing both curiosity and concern. At 65, my dearest friend had maintained the direct manner that had first drawn me to her during our university days. We settled in, the garden with a light lunch. "You're looking better," she observed, studying me over her iced tea. "There's a spark back in your eyes." "I feel more like myself," I agreed. "Not physically, that's still a work in progress. But mentally, I've found clarity." "About what?" "About Richard. About Oakridge. About what I want my legacy to be," I explained. Everything. The overheard conversation, my meetings with Sylvia and Dr. Chen, the planned donation. Caroline listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to understanding to fierce approval. "I've never trusted that man," she said when I finished. "Not completely. Even when you were first married, there was something calculated about his devotion." "I was blind to it," I admitted. "Or perhaps I saw what I wanted to see. Either way, I'm seeing clearly now." "So you're really going through with this? Donating Oakridge? The paperwork will be finalized next week. All that remains is telling Richard." Caroline reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'll be right by your side when you do. Or if you prefer privacy for that conversation, I'll be waiting with ice. A bottle of excellent scotch afterward." I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd experienced in months. "I'm counting on both, the support and the scotch." "Where will you go?" she asked. "Once the donation is complete?" "That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Lucas mentioned that the cottage next to yours on Mirror Lake might be available soon. Do you think the owner would consider selling?" Caroline's eyes widened. "You want to move to Mirror Lake?" "It seems right," I said. "Close to you, peaceful surroundings, but still near enough to Meadowbrook for my ongoing treatment. And I've always loved visiting you there." "Margaret would sell to you in a heartbeat," Caroline said excitedly. "She's been considering moving to Arizona to be near her daughter's family. But Veronica, it's a modest cottage, nothing like Oakridge." "That's rather the point," I smiled. "After all these years of maintaining a historic mansion, I'm ready for simplicity. A home that serves my needs rather than the other way around." That afternoon, Caroline and I drove to Mirror Lake to see the cottage. Nestled among pine trees with a view of the water, the small 2-bedroom home offered precisely what I sought: beauty without ostentation, comfort without excess. As we walked along the shoreline, I felt a growing certainty that this would be my next chapter. "I'll call Margaret tonight," Caroline promised as we drove back. "If she agrees, we could have the preliminary paperwork done before Richard returns from Chicago." "Perfect," I said, watching the scenery pass by my window. Everything is falling into place. Sunday evening arrived with the distant rumble of thunder, a summer storm gathering strength as Richard's car pulled into the driveway. I had spent the weekend finalizing arrangements. The Mirror Lake cottage was now under contract, with closing scheduled for the following week. Sylvia had prepared all necessary documentation for the Oakridge donation, awaiting only my signature and Richard's acknowledgement as my spouse, though his consent wasn't legally required. I had arranged the paperwork on the desk in the library, our most neutral territory. Not our bedroom with its intimate history, not the sunroom where I'd overheard his betrayal. The library had always been primarily my domain, filled with literature Richard rarely touched, decorated with artifacts from my academic career. "Veronica?" His voice echoed through the foyer. "I'm home." "In the library," I called back, straightening my posture in the leather chair that had been my father's. Richard appeared in the doorway, still in his travel clothes, his expression shifting from fatigue to wariness as he noted my formal posture and the papers arranged before me. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Marking student essays again? I thought you were retired." "These aren't essays," I said calmly. "They're legal documents regarding Oakridge." His attention sharpened instantly, just as I knew it would. Any mention of the estate always elicited his full focus. "What about Oakridge?" "Please sit down, Richard. We need to have an important conversation." He hesitated before settling into the chair opposite mine, the antique desk between us like a negotiating table. "You're being very mysterious. Is something wrong with the property?" "The property is fine," I assured him. "It's our marriage that isn't." His expression froze, then rearranged itself into concerned bewilderment. "What are you talking about? Is this about the charity gala?" "I know I was short with you, but I was tired." 2 months ago," I interrupted, "I overheard you speaking with Edward in the sunroom. You said I had become a burden with my illness. You discussed your plans for Oakridge once you inherited it, the wellness retreat you wanted to build in the East Wing." All color drained from Richard's face. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Veronica, you misunderstood." "Please don't insult my intelligence by denying what I heard with my own ears." He shifted strategies immediately, leaning forward with an earnest expression. "You caught me at a weak moment. Edward was pressing me about investment opportunities, and I was exhausted from caring for you. Surely you understand the strain I've been under?" "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice level. "I understand that after 32 years of marriage, you see me as an obstacle to your ambitions. I understand that you're waiting for my death to claim what you believe should be yours." "That's not fair," he protested, anger beginning to replace shock. "I've supported you throughout this illness, driven you to appointments, research treatments, rearranged my entire professional life." "For which I was grateful," I acknowledged, "until I realized it wasn't motivated by love, but by calculated self-interest." "This is absurd," he snapped, standing abruptly. "You're twisting things because of your illness. The medications, the stress, they're affecting your judgment." I smiled thinly at the predictable attempt to undermine my mental competence. Dr. Abernathy would disagree, as would Dr. Chen, Sylvia Goldman, and Caroline, all of whom are fully aware of my decisions and have affirmed my capacity to make them. Richard paced before the fireplace, running his hand through his hair, a gesture I had once found endearing. "What decisions? What are you talking about?" "I've donated Oakridge Manor to the Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation," I said simply. "They will establish the Calloway Center for Women's Cancer Research, focusing on early detection methods that could save thousands of lives." He stopped mid-stride, staring at me in disbelief. "You what?" "The papers are being finalized this week. I've purchased a cottage at Mirror Lake where I'll be living. You'll receive the Vermont summer house and a monthly stipend from my family trust. The donation is structured to provide significant tax benefits that will offset—" "You can't do this," he interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oakridge is our home. My home. You can't just give it away on a vindictive whim." "It's not a whim," I replied calmly. "It's a carefully considered decision about my legacy and about how I choose to spend whatever time I have left, whether that's months or years." "I'll contest it," he threatened. "As your husband, I have rights. You can't disinherit me completely." "You're not being disinherited completely," You're receiving the Vermont property and a comfortable income. Sylvia has ensured everything is legally sound. Richard's face contorted with rage and disbelief. This is how you repay decades of marriage? By giving away our home to strangers? This is how I reclaim my dignity, I corrected him. And they're not strangers. They're scientists working to ensure other women don't face what I have. He slumped into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. When he looked up, his expression had transformed to wounded betrayal, an expression I suspected he had practiced for difficult conversations with patients. I've made mistakes, he conceded, his voice softening. That conversation with Edward, it was just frustration talking. You know I love you, Veronica. We can work through this. Couples therapy, perhaps, but this decision is too drastic, too permanent. I had anticipated this approach, the strategic retreat, the appeal to our history, the request for second chances. But the script I might once have followed, accepting his explanation and shelving my own needs for the sake of peace, no longer held power over me. The decision is made, I said firmly. The papers require your signature as a formality, but the donation will proceed with or without it. I'm telling you as a courtesy and to give you time to make your own arrangements. His facade cracked, genuine fury breaking through. You vindictive bitch. You think you're punishing me, but you're destroying yourself too. That cottage at Mirror Lake, it's nothing compared to Oakridge. You're throwing away generations of your family's heritage because of one overheard conversation. No, I said, standing to signal the end of our discussion. I'm creating a new legacy, because that conversation finally allowed me to see the truth about our marriage. The papers are here when you're ready to sign them. I'll be staying at Caroline's tonight to give you space to process this. I moved toward the door, but Richard blocked my path, his face inches from mine. This isn't over, he hissed. You're ill, emotionally unstable. No court would uphold such a radical decision made under these circumstances. My oncologist, my attorney, and 3 independent doctors would disagree, I replied calmly, as would the extensive journal I've kept documenting my decision-making process and rationale. Now, please step aside. For a moment I thought he might refuse. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. A glimpse of the true Richard, perhaps, stripped of social veneer. Then he moved aside, his body rigid with controlled rage. You'll regret this, he said softly as I passed him. When you're alone in that cottage with no one to care for you, when the cancer returns, and it will, Veronica, the statistics are clear, you'll wish you hadn't alienated the one person who was willing to stand by you. His words were calculated to wound, to exploit my deepest fears. 6 months ago, they might have succeeded, but I had faced mortality now, had looked directly at my worst fears, and found them less terrifying than a life defined by someone else's expectations. Goodbye, Richard, I said, continuing toward the door. Caroline will bring me back tomorrow to collect some personal items. I suggest you use this time to consider your options. Fighting the donation will only create public embarrassment for both of us. I left him standing in the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of authors who had chronicled human nature in all its complexity. Perhaps somewhere on those shelves was a story that might help him understand what had happened to our marriage. More likely, he would never truly comprehend how completely his betrayal had transformed me. Caroline was waiting in her car at the end of the driveway, as promised. Her expression was a mixture of concern and determination as I slid into the passenger seat. "How did it go?" she asked, putting the car in drive. "About as expected," I replied, watching Oakridge recede in the side mirror. Denial, then anger, then manipulation, then threats. "Are you all right?" I considered the question carefully. Was I all right? My marriage of 3 decades was effectively over. I was leaving the home where I had expected to spend my remaining years. I had a cancer diagnosis with an uncertain prognosis. Yet beneath these objective losses was a surprising sense of liberation. as if I had set down a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. "I'm better than all right," I finally answered. "I'm free." The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as we drove away, rain pounding against the windshield in sheets. Caroline turned on the wipers to their highest setting, peering forward into the deluge. "Appropriate weather for dramatic life changes," she observed wryly. I laughed, the sound surprising us both. Indeed. Cleansing, renewal, all those literary metaphors. "You're really doing this," she said, glancing at me with newfound respect. "Leaving everything behind to start fresh." "Not everything," I corrected her. "Just the parts that no longer serve who I am now. I'm keeping what matters. My self-respect, my agency, my closest friendships, and I'm gaining something precious." "What's that?" "The chance to define my own ending," I said, watching lightning illuminate the storm clouds ahead. "However much time I have left, it belongs truly to me now." We drove the rest of the way to Caroline's house in companionable silence, the rhythm of the wipers marking time like a metronome. Tomorrow would bring practical challenges, collecting my most treasured possessions from Oakridge, finalizing the legal transfers, preparing for the move to Mirror Lake. Richard might attempt to create obstacles, or he might retreat to Lick, his wounds and plot a longer-term strategy. But tonight, as the storm raged around us, I felt strangely peaceful. The worst confrontation was behind me. I had faced my greatest fear. Not death, but the knowledge that the life I had built was founded on illusion and had emerged stronger for it. "We're here," Caroline said, pulling into her driveway. "Welcome to the first night of your new life." I stepped from the car into the rain, tilting my face upward to feel the cleansing downpour. Let it wash away the last vestiges of who I had been, the accommodating wife, the keeper of a historic home, the woman who measured her worth through others' perceptions. Whoever emerged from this storm would be more authentically me than I had been in decades. "Come inside before you catch pneumonia," Caroline called from the porch. "The scotch is waiting." I joined her, soaked but smiling. "To new beginnings," I said as we entered the warmth of her home. "To claiming what's rightfully yours," she replied. "Your life, your choices, your future, however long or short it may be." The following morning, Caroline and I returned to Oakridge. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean clarity to the air and glistening droplets on the roses that lined the driveway. My roses, planted and tended over decades, each variety chosen with care. Soon they would belong to the Meadowbrook Foundation, though I hoped whoever managed the property would continue to nurture them. Richard's car was gone. A relief, though not a surprise. He had never been one to stay and fight when retreat offered strategic advantages. No doubt he was consulting with attorneys, exploring ways to contest the donation, or at least extract more favorable terms. "Let me go in first," Caroline suggested, her hand on the door. "Just to make sure." "He wouldn't still be here," I assured her. Richard avoids direct confrontation. It's one of his more predictable traits. Nevertheless, we entered cautiously. The house felt different somehow, as if it too sensed the coming change in ownership. I had lived in Oakridge for over 30 years, had supervised its meticulous restoration, had researched its history and preserved its architectural integrity. Yet as I moved through the familiar rooms, I felt increasingly detached from the space. Like a curator preparing to transfer a valuable artifact to a new institution, rather than a homeowner leaving a beloved residence. "Where should we start?" Caroline asked, surveying the vast collection of furnishings, artwork, and personal items accumulated over decades. "My study and the master bedroom," I decided. Most of the furniture stays with the house. It's built for these spaces. I'm just taking personal items, clothing, and a few select pieces with sentimental value. We worked methodically, filling boxes with photographs, correspondence, my academic awards and publications. From the library, I selected only a fraction of my extensive book collection, the rare first editions, personally inscribed volumes from fellow scholars, and the dog-eared paperbacks that had shaped my intellectual development. In the bedroom, Caroline helped me sort through clothing. "You won't need all these formal gowns at Mirror Lake," she observed, holding up a beaded evening dress I'd worn to university fundraisers. "No," I agreed. "A simpler life awaits." As we packed, I found myself sharing stories. The provenance of my grandmother's locket, the conference in Edinburgh where I'd purchased a particular cashmere shawl, the significance of the small watercolor, painting that had been a gift from my first mentor at university. "You're saying goodbye," Caroline noted gently. "Not just to the house, but to certain chapters of your life." "Yes," I acknowledged. "But not with sadness. Each of these objects represents something I've experienced, learned, survived. I don't need all of them to remember who I am." By mid-afternoon, we had filled Caroline's car with the essential items I would need immediately. The rest would be moved once the cottage closing was complete and the donation finalized. As we prepared to leave, I walked through the gardens one last time. The roses were approaching their midsummer peak, their fragrance intensified by the previous night's rain. I clipped one perfect bloom, a deep crimson variety called Prosperity, that I had planted the year Oakridge became mine. "A memento?" Caroline asked as I carefully wrapped the stem in a damp paper towel. "A symbol," I corrected, "of what endures beyond specific circumstances." We were just pulling away when a sleek black car I didn't recognize turned into the driveway. Edward's Jaguar, with my brother-in-law at the wheel and Richard in the passenger seat. "Do you want to leave anyway?" Caroline asked, pausing at the end of the drive. I considered it. Avoiding another confrontation would be easier, but running away had never been my style. "No," I decided. "Let's see what they want." We parked and waited as Edward and Richard approached. Richard had changed into a lawyer's uniform, dark suit, crisp white shirt, power tie. Edward's expression suggested he'd been drafted as reluctant backup. "Veronica," Richard said stiffly, "I'd hoped to catch you here. We need to talk." "We talked last night," I reminded him. "I have nothing more to add." "You've had time to reconsider," he pressed. "Edward has some suggestions for a more reasonable arrangement." I glanced at Edward, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Does he? And what might those be?" Edward cleared his throat. "Veronica, Richard explained the misunderstanding that's occurred. What if instead of donating Oakridge outright, you established a trust? The property could eventually go to the foundation, but you and Richard would retain lifetime use rights." "That's not a misunderstanding," I said coolly. "That's a fundamental reshuffling of my intentions." "It's a compromise," Richard interjected, "one that acknowledges your charitable wishes while respecting our marriage." "Our marriage," I repeated, the irony thick in my voice. "The one where you consider me a burden and wait impatiently for my death to claim your inheritance?" Edward winced, glancing at his brother. "She overheard a private conversation and misinterpreted it," Richard explained quickly. I was stressed, venting to Edward about the difficulties of caregiving. "Surely you can understand that, Caroline? Being a caregiver yourself for your late husband?" Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare compare yourself to actual devoted caregivers, Richard. What I understand is that you showed your true colors when you thought no one was listening." "This isn't productive," Edward cut in, ever the peacemaker. "Veronica, we're only asking that you consider less drastic options. A charitable remainder trust would still benefit the foundation eventually." "My decision is made," I said firmly. "The papers are ready for signatures. Richard can choose to handle this gracefully or not. That's his prerogative. But it won't change the outcome." Richard's carefully maintained composure cracked. "You think you're being noble," he sneered. "The self-sacrificing academic giving away her fortune. But you're being manipulated by that foundation. They've seen A vulnerable widow with a terminal diagnosis and dollar signs appeared in their eyes. "I'm neither vulnerable nor technically a widow yet," I pointed out dryly. "And Dr. Chen is a researcher, not a vulture, unlike some people I could name." Edward placed a restraining hand on Richard's arm as he took a step forward. "This isn't helping, Richard." "You're right," I agreed. "It isn't. I've made my decision, informed by 32 years of marriage and 2 months of clarity since I heard what my husband really thinks of me. The donation will proceed. Then I'll contest it," Richard threatened. "I'll have you declared mentally incompetent. The stress of cancer treatment, the medications, they've affected your judgment." Caroline stepped forward protectively. "Try it," she challenged. "3 independent physicians have already confirmed Veronica's mental competence, anticipating exactly this tactic. Plus, you're a cardiologist, not a psychiatrist. Your medical opinion on mental competence would be worth precisely nothing in court." Richard looked momentarily taken aback at the thoroughness of our preparations. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into the detached professional mask he wore with difficult patience. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You've had your dramatic gesture, but there are legal realities you can't circumvent. As your husband, I have rights." "Indeed you do," I acknowledged. "To fair treatment, which you're receiving. The Vermont property and the monthly stipend are generous provisions by any standard. A cottage in the woods and an allowance like a child," he scoffed. "After 3 decades of marriage." "A marriage you reduced to a waiting game," I reminded him. "Counting the days until I'd be gone and Oakridge would be yours." Edward looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time," he suggested, "when emotions aren't so raw." "There's nothing more to discuss," I said with finality. "The paperwork is with Sylvia. Richard can sign voluntarily or contest it. That's his choice. Either way, I'm moving forward." I turned to leave, Caroline beside me. Richard called after me, his voice taking on the conciliatory tone he used when he realized intimidation wasn't working. "Veronica, please. We can work through this. 32 years counts for something." I paused, looking back at the man I had once loved with complete trust, the man I had believed would stand beside me through whatever life brought. "Yes," I agreed softly. 32 years does count for something. It counts for the depth of the betrayal when I heard how you really see me. It counts for the clarity I now have about what a one-sided relationship I've been living in. And it counts for my absolute certainty that I'm making the right decision now. In the car, Caroline squeezed my hand. "You were magnificent," she said as we drove away. "Absolutely clear and unwavering." "I feel almost sorry for him," I admitted. "He truly doesn't understand what he's done wrong. In his mind, planning to repurpose Oakridge after my presumed death was simply practical forward thinking, not a betrayal." "That's because Richard has always viewed relationships as transactions," Caroline observed. "What you can do for him, what assets you bring to the equation. He's incapable of seeing the deeper betrayal." At Caroline's house, we unpacked the car, arranging my essential belongings in her guest room. The cottage closing was still a week away, and I was grateful for her hospitality during this liminal period, no longer living at Oakridge but not yet established in my new home. That evening, as we shared a quiet dinner on her porch overlooking the lake, my phone rang. "Dr. Abernathy's office." "Mrs. Harrington," came his measured voice when I answered. "I've been reviewing your latest test. Results. There's something we should discuss. Could you come in tomorrow?" "Of course," I replied, my heart rate accelerating despite my attempt at calm. Has something changed?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person," he said, his professional tone revealing nothing. "But I can tell you that Dr. Chen's protocol appears to be having significant effects." After hanging up, I sat in silence, absorbing the careful neutrality of his words. Significant effects could mean many things, both positive and negative. Caroline watched me with concern. What did he say? He wants to see me tomorrow to discuss my test results. Something about significant effects from Dr. Chen's treatment protocol. That sounds promising, she offered cautiously. Perhaps, I agreed. Or perhaps not. Either way, it changes nothing about my decisions. We sat watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and rose. Whatever news awaited me tomorrow, whether days, months, or years remained, I had reclaimed my power to shape how those days would be spent and what legacy I would leave behind. To significant effects, Caroline said, raising her wine glass. I smiled, touching my glass to hers. Whatever they may be. Dr. Abernathy's office was on the top floor of the Westmore Medical Center, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I had spent countless hours in this room over the past months, receiving diagnosis, discussing treatment options, reviewing test results. The space had witnessed my most vulnerable moments, yet today it felt different. I was different. Caroline had offered to accompany me, but I declined. Whatever news awaited, I wanted to face it independently. Richard had always been the one, beside me at these appointments. His absence today was another marker of my new reality. Dr. Abernathy greeted me with his usual calm professionalism, shaking my hand before gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. At 65, with silver hair and thoughtful eyes behind rimless glasses, he exuded the quiet authority that had made him one of the region's most respected oncologists. Mrs. Harrington, thank you for coming in so quickly, he began, opening a folder containing my latest test results. As I mentioned on the phone, we've seen some significant changes since you began Dr. Chen's experimental protocol. I braced myself, maintaining a composed expression. I appreciate your directness, doctor. Please tell me exactly where things stand. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. The treatment appears to be working better than we anticipated. The primary tumor has reduced in size by nearly 40%, and we're seeing decreased activity in the previously identified metastatic sites. I blinked, processing his words. That's positive, then? Very positive, he confirmed, turning the folder so I could see the comparative scan images. This response rate exceeds our statistical expectations for stage 3 ovarian cancer, especially given the aggressive nature of your particular type. Relief washed through me, quickly followed by a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't immediately identify. What does this mean in practical terms? For my prognosis? It means we need to recalibrate our thinking, Dr. Abernathy said carefully. When we first discussed your diagnosis, we were looking at a likely timeline measured in months, with treatment offering modest extensions. Now, he paused, choosing his words precisely. Now we're discussing the possibility of years, perhaps many years if this response continues. Years. The word hung in the air between us, weighted with implications I was only beginning to comprehend. I had been making decisions, profound, life-altering decisions, based on the assumption of limited time. My donation of Oakridge, my break with Richard, my plans for a simplified life at Mirror Lake, all had been shaped by the expectation of a foreshortened future. You seem surprised, Dr. Abernathy observed. Most patients react with immediate joy to this kind of news. I am joyful, I assured him, finding my voice. Just recalibrating, as you said. When you're told your time is limited, you make certain choices. Priorities become crystal clear. He nodded with understanding. And now those choices may need to be revisited? No, I said firmly, surprising myself with the immediacy of my response. My choices remain the same. They were right regardless of how much time I have left. Perhaps especially if I have more time. Dr. Abernathy smiled slightly. I've noticed something interesting in my years of practice. The patients who truly come to terms with mortality often experience a kind of freedom. Their decisions become more authentic, less influenced by external expectations. Exactly, I agreed. Cancer stripped away pretense, mine and others. I've seen clearly who and what matters in my life. He closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. Dr. Chen will want to discuss continuing the protocol, perhaps with some modifications based on your response. But I wanted to deliver this news personally, given our long-standing relationship. Thank you, I said sincerely. For everything. Richard. Isn't with you today, he observed, careful neutrality in his tone. As a colleague of Richard's on the hospital board, he was undoubtedly aware something had changed. No, I confirmed. We're transitioning to separate lives. He nodded without judgment. I see. Well, Veronica, whatever path you choose, you're facing it with significantly improved medical prospects. As I left the medical center, sunlight struck my face with unexpected warmth. The world appeared sharper somehow, colors more vibrant, sounds more distinct. Was this how it felt to be handed back time you had mentally relinquished? I sat on a bench in the hospital garden, needing a moment to absorb the implications before driving back to Caroline's. My phone chimed with a text message from Sylvia. Richard's attorney called, requesting meeting to discuss settlement terms. Progress, I smiled at her characteristic brevity. Richard moving to negotiations rather than outright opposition suggested he was beginning to accept reality. I typed back, "We'll call later. Meeting with Abernathy just finished. Significant positive news our treatment." Her response came immediately. "Excellent. Cellular or legal?" "Both," I replied. "More time on all fronts." Driving back to Caroline's, I took the scenic route along the lakeshore. Sailboats dotted the blue expanse, their white sails bright against the water. Families picnicked in waterfront parks, children splashed in the shallows, couples walked hand in hand along the promenade. Ordinary people living ordinary days, the kind of days I had thought might be limited for me. Now, unexpectedly, more of those days stretched before me. The question was, how would I use them? Caroline was waiting anxiously on her porch when I pulled into the driveway. One look at my face told her everything. "Good news," she breathed, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I can see it in your eyes." Inside, over tea at her kitchen table, I shared Dr. Abernathy's report. Caroline listened with growing delight, tears gathering in her eyes. "Oh, Veronica," she said when I finished. "This is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful." "It is," I agreed. "And yet, strangely disorienting. I've been making peace with a certain timeline. Adjusting to more time requires its own adaptation. But a far happier adaptation," she pointed out. "And it changes nothing about Richard's betrayal or your decision regarding Oakridge." "Exactly what I told Dr. Abernathy," I said. "My choices remain the same. If anything, having more time strengthens my resolve to live authentically, without compromise." "Richard will try to use this to his advantage," Caroline warned. "He'll argue that your decisions were made under the pressure of a dire prognosis. That no longer applies." "Let him try," I shrugged. "The donation wasn't contingent on my illness. It's about legacy, purpose, and reclaiming agency in my life, all of which remain relevant whether I have months or decades ahead." My phone rang, Sylvia calling to discuss Richard's settlement overture. I answered, putting her on speaker so Caroline could participate. "His attorney is suggesting a mediation session," Sylvia explained. "They're backing away from contesting the donation entirely, but want to negotiate the terms of what Richard receives." "Meaning he wants more than the Vermont property and the monthly stipend?" I clarified. "Precisely. They're suggesting you keep the Vermont property as a vacation home that you both share, which seems problematic given your separation, and that his stipend be significantly increased." "Not happening. Caroline interjected firmly. I agree, I said. The current provisions are fair. More than fair, considering what I heard him say about me. That's my assessment as well, Sylvia confirmed. But a mediation session might be useful. It allows him to feel heard while ultimately reinforcing that your decision stands. Men like Richard often need the appearance of having influenced the outcome, even when they haven't. Always the diplomat, Sylvia, I smiled. When would this mediation occur? They're suggesting next week. I recommend doing it before your cottage closing to clear the path forward. Fine, I agreed. Set it up. But be clear that while I'll listen, the fundamental decision about Oakridge is non-negotiable. After hanging up, Caroline and I took our tea to the porch swing overlooking the lake. The afternoon was waning, golden light turning the water to molten amber. In the distance, I could see the roofline of my soon-to-be cottage peeking through the pines. What will you do with all this unexpected time? Caroline asked softly. I considered the question, watching a heron glide across the water, its reflection a perfect mirror image below. First, I'll settle into the cottage. Then perhaps I'll write that book on female Gothic novelists I've been researching for decades. Travel to the literary landmarks Richard never wanted to visit. Mentor promising students. Volunteer at Meadowbrook. Once the research center is established at Oakridge. A full life, she observed with approval. A meaningful one, I agreed. On my terms, not defined by someone else's expectations or limitations. That evening, I wrote in my journal, Today I received an unexpected gift, the possibility of more time. Dr. Abernathy says the treatment is working beyond expectations. The future that had seemed so compressed now expands before me, full of possibilities I hadn't dared consider. What fascinates me most is how this news changes nothing about my core decisions. The clarity I found in facing mortality remains. Richard's betrayal isn't lessened by the prospect of more years. If anything, it's heightened. He was willing to wait out what he thought would be a brief illness to claim what he wanted. Never. Imagining I would discover his true feelings or take actions to thwart his plans. Oakridge will still become the Calloway Center. I will still move to Mirror Lake. I will still reclaim the parts of myself that were submerged in marriage. The difference is simply that I may have more time to see these decisions bear fruit, to witness the legacy I've chosen rather than merely setting it in motion. Perhaps that's the most powerful revelation. When faced with mortality, we make choices that reveal our truest selves. Those choices remain valid whether death is imminent or distant. The question is never really, what would you do if you had only months to live? But rather, what would you do if you were living with complete authenticity? My answer remains the same. The next morning brought another surprise. An email from Dr. Chen requesting a meeting at Meadowbrook. In light of your test results and our ongoing discussions about Oakridge, she wrote, there are some possibilities I'd like to explore. With you. I responded immediately, agreeing to meet that afternoon. Whatever she had in mind, I was intrigued. The synchronicity of my improved medical outlook and the planned research center felt meaningful, as if perhaps my personal journey and my public legacy were aligning in ways I couldn't have anticipated. As I prepared to leave for Meadowbrook, Catherine Morgan, the philanthropist I'd met at the hospital gala, called unexpectedly. Veronica, she greeted me warmly. I hope I'm not interrupting. I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala and wondering if you'd still be interested. In that lunch we discussed? I would, I replied, genuinely pleased by her outreach. Though I should mention that my circumstances have changed somewhat since we spoke. Oh? Her interest was piqued. I'm in the process of donating Oakridge Manor to establish a cancer research center, I explained, and separating from Richard. A moment of silence followed. Then Catherine chuckled softly. My dear, it seems we have even more to discuss than I realized. Are you free tomorrow? We arranged to meet at her lake house, coincidentally not far from my soon-to-be cottage. As I hung up, I felt another piece falling into place in this new life I was building. New connections, new possibilities, new purpose, all emerging from what had initially seemed like an ending. The Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation looked different to me now. Where before I had seen it through the lens of my own mortality, a place that might help others even if it had come too late for me, I now saw it with the perspective of someone who might witness its evolution, perhaps even contribute to its work for years to come. Dr. Chen greeted me with genuine warmth, her eyes alight with excitement that went beyond professional interest. "Mrs. Harrington, Veronica, thank you for coming. I've just been reviewing your latest results with Dr. Abernathy. The response is remarkable." "So I've been told," I smiled, taking the seat she offered in her sunlit office. "Though I'm still adjusting to the implications." "Of course," she nodded. "It's a significant psychological shift. But it's precisely that shift I wanted to discuss with you, especially in light of your generous donation of Oakridge." She opened a folder containing architectural renderings, preliminary concepts for transforming Oakridge into a research center. The main house would become administrative offices and meeting spaces, while new structures, designed to complement the historical architecture, would house laboratories and clinical areas. "These are just initial concepts," she explained. "But I wanted you to see how we envision honoring the property's heritage while adapting it for scientific purposes." I studied the drawings, deeply moved by how thoughtfully they balanced preservation and innovation. "They're beautiful," I said sincerely. "Exactly what I'd hoped for." "I'm glad you approve," she smiled. "But there's something else I'd like to propose, given your improved prognosis." She hesitated, then continued. "We would like to invite you to join the advisory board for the Calloway Center. Your academic background, your personal experience with cancer, and your connection to Oakridge make you uniquely qualified to help shape the center's vision and priorities." The invitation caught me completely by surprise. I'm not a scientist or a medical professional," I said hesitantly. "The board needs more than just technical expertise," Dr. Chen explained. "We need people who understand the human impact of cancer, who can help ensure our research remains connected to the real experiences of patients and families. Your literature background gives you a perspective on narrative and meaning that most scientists lack." I considered her offer, feeling a strange alignment of purpose forming. Would this role begin immediately, even before the center is established? "Yes," she confirmed. "We're already forming the leadership team that will guide the transition and development. Your input would be invaluable from the start." For a moment, I was transported back to my academic career, the committee meetings, the collaborative projects, the sense of contributing to something larger than myself. I had set aside that aspect of my identity when I retired, focusing instead on the caretaking role that had gradually become my primary definition. Now, unexpectedly, I was being offered a new avenue for intellectual engagement and meaningful contribution. "I would be honored," I said finally. "Though I should warn you, I have a reputation for asking difficult questions and challenging assumptions." Dr. Chen laughed. "That's precisely why we want you involved. Science advances through questioning, not compliance." As we discussed the details of the advisory board structure and responsibilities, I felt a growing excitement. This wasn't merely a legacy project I was setting in motion before departing. It was something I might help nurture and develop over time. The prospect added a dimension to my future I hadn't dared imagine. "There's one more thing," Dr. Chen said as our meeting concluded. "The cottage you're purchasing at Mirror Lake. It's quite close to our satellite research facility. We maintain several guest apartments there for visiting researchers. Should you ever need closer medical supervision during treatment phases, you'd have access to those facilities." Her offer brought tears to my eyes, not for the practical support it represented, but for the underlying assumption that I would be part of this community for the long term. That my future, however uncertain in duration, would be integrated with the work of the foundation in multiple ways. "Thank you," I managed. for seeing me as more than just a donor or a patient. You're a partner in this endeavor now, she said simply. In whatever capacity you choose, for as long as you wish. Driving back to Caroline's, I felt a new sense of purpose forming, not replacing but complementing my initial reasons for donating Oakridge. What had begun as a reclamation of agency in the face of betrayal and mortality was evolving into something more forward-looking, a meaningful role that would engage my mind, honor my values, and potentially help countless women facing diagnoses like mine. Caroline was hosting her book club when I returned, but she excused herself briefly to hear how my meeting had gone. Her delight at Dr. Chen's invitation was immediate and genuine. "This is perfect for you," she declared. "You're academic, mind needs engagement, and to be involved from the ground up in shaping something so important, it's exactly what you need." "It feels right," I agreed, like pieces falling into place that I couldn't have arranged deliberately. "That's how the best chapters of life often begin," she observed wisely. The following day brought my lunch with Catherine Morgan. Her lakefront estate was elegant but unpretentious. A beautifully designed home that prioritized comfort and views of the water over ostentatious displays of wealth. Catherine herself, a widow in her 70s with impeccable silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, greeted me on her terrace overlooking the lake. "Veronica." "Welcome," she said, clasping my hands warmly. "I've been looking forward to getting to know you better." Over a lunch of chilled soup and locally caught fish, Catherine revealed that her interest in me went beyond casual socializing. "I've been watching you for some time," she admitted. "At university functions, hospital events, I recognized something in you, a capacity that wasn't being fully utilized." "That's remarkably perceptive," I said, surprised by her directness. "When you've lived as long as I have, you develop an eye for potential," she smiled. "I've spent the last 15 years since my husband's death focusing on strategic philanthropy. Not just giving money, but ensuring it creates meaningful change." As she described her approach to charitable giving, rigorous, impact-focused, and deeply personal, I understood why she had reached out after our brief interaction at the gala. "When you challenged Richard's dismissive attitude toward named gifts, I knew my instincts about you were correct," she continued. "And now I hear you're donating Oakridge to establish a research center. I'd like to know more." I shared the story, edited slightly to protect some privacy, of my diagnosis, Richard's betrayal, and my decision to reclaim my agency by redirecting my inheritance toward cancer research. Catherine listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions but mostly absorbing my narrative without judgment. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "Your approach resonates with my philanthropic philosophy," she said. "Creating lasting impact by aligning your values with your resources. But I'm curious, now that your prognosis has improved, has your perspective on the donation changed?" "Not at all," I replied firmly. "If anything, having potentially more time strengthens my commitment. I can be more actively involved in shaping what the Calloway Center becomes." "Excellent," she said, her expression satisfied. "Because I'd like to propose a collaboration." She outlined her idea. The Morgan Foundation would establish a substantial matching fund for the Calloway Center, effectively doubling the impact of my donation. Additionally, she wanted to create a joint program between the children's wing she had funded at Westmore Medical Center and the Calloway Center, focused specifically on hereditary cancer research affecting multiple generations. Our foundations would work in tandem, she explained, creating a more comprehensive approach than either could achieve alone. I was momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of what she was suggesting. "That's extraordinarily generous, Catherine. Why would you do this?" She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Several reasons. First, it's a sound philanthropic investment. Dr. Chen's research shows tremendous promise. Second, I've always believed women should support each other's initiatives, especially in medical research where female-specific cancers have historically been underfunded. She paused, then added more softly, "And third, I must admit to some satisfaction in imagining Richard's reaction when he realizes the scope of what you've set in motion. Men like him underestimate women like us at their peril." I laughed, appreciating her candor. He certainly underestimated me. "Most society wives are underestimated," Catherine observed. "We're viewed as decorative appendages to our husbands, achievements. Even those of us with our own careers and accomplishments find ourselves gradually reduced to supporting roles. It's refreshing to see someone reject that diminishment so thoroughly." By the time lunch concluded, we had sketched the framework of a partnership that would significantly expand the impact of my original vision for Oakridge. Catherine promised to have her foundation's legal team contact Sylvia to begin formalizing the arrangement. "I feel I should warn you," I said as she walked me to my car. "Richard isn't taking this lying down. He's requested mediation to negotiate the terms of what he receives." Catherine waved this away dismissively. "Men like Richard always believe they can negotiate their way out of consequences. Let him try. Once our partnership is announced, he'll understand the train has left the station." Her confidence was bracing. Driving away, I realized I had found not just a philanthropic partner, but a potential mentor in navigating this new phase of life. Catherine had transformed widowhood from an ending into a platform for meaningful impact. Her example suggested possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. The mediation session with Richard was scheduled for the following afternoon at Sylvia's office. I spent the morning preparing mentally, reviewing the documentation Sylvia had provided outlining our current offer and the limits of what I was willing to consider. The Vermont property and monthly stipend were already generous. I would not be moved to provide substantially more. As I dressed for the meeting, I chose my outfit deliberately. A tailored navy suit that projected authority rather than the softer, more accommodating style Richard was accustomed to seeing me wear. I fastened my mother's pearls around my neck, a tangible connection to the Calloway women who had stewarded Oakridge before me, and who, I felt certain, would approve of its new purpose. Caroline hugged me before I left. "Remember who you are," she said simply. "Don't let him make you doubt yourself." "Not anymore," I promised, straightening my shoulders as I walked to my car. The time for doubt had passed. Whatever happened in today's mediation, I was moving forward, with clear purpose and newfound strength. Richard might still be underestimating me, still believing he could negotiate his way back to advantage. He was about to discover how profoundly things had changed. Sylvia's conference room was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling, imposing leather chairs, and a table large enough to maintain significant physical distance between opposing parties. As a setting for confrontation, it was perfect. As a place for reconciliation, it was perhaps less ideal. Richard arrived with his attorney, Bradley Whitmore, a divorce specialist with a reputation for aggressive tactics. I was flanked by Sylvia and a younger associate who specialized in charitable, giving law. The contrast in legal approaches was not coincidental. Richard was preparing for battle, while I was focused on establishing a legacy. "Thank you all for coming," began the mediator, a retired judge named Helen Grayson. "I understand we're here to discuss terms related to the donation of Oakridge Manor to the Meadowbrook Cancer Research Foundation, and specifically, what provisions will be made for Dr. Harrington following this donation." Richard sat directly across from me, impeccably dressed as always, his expression a careful blend of concern and reasonableness, the same look he adopted when delivering difficult news to patients. I recognized the strategy: appear rational and caring while portraying the other party as emotional and unreasonable. "Before we begin," Sylvia interjected smoothly, "I'd like to clarify that this is not a negotiation about whether Oakridge will be donated. That decision has been made by my client, who has full legal authority to dispose of her inherited property as she sees fit. Today's discussion concerns only what provisions will be made for Dr. Harrington in light of this decision. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whitmore leaned forward. With respect, the disposition of marital assets during an ongoing marriage requires mutual consent. While Oakridge may have come to Mrs. Harrington through inheritance, its status as the marital home for 3 decades gives Dr. Harrington certain equitable interests. Interesting legal theory, Sylvia replied dryly, but not applicable under state law regarding inherited assets that have been maintained as separate property, which Oakridge demonstrably has been. However, we're not here to argue legal positions. My client has voluntarily offered certain provisions out of respect for the marriage's duration. The mediator nodded. Let's focus on those provisions then. What specifically is being offered? Sylvia outlined the proposal. Richard would receive the Vermont vacation property valued at approximately $800,000, plus a monthly stipend of $6,000, from my family trust for the remainder of his life, or until remarriage. Additionally, he would keep his own retirement accounts and investments, which were substantial after decades of medical practice. This arrangement is entirely one-sided, Whitmore argued. Dr. Harrington loses his primary residence and receives a fraction of the estate's value. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harrington retains control over the family trust and the prestige of establishing this research center. Actually, I said, speaking for the first time, I'm not retaining control in the way you suggest. The bulk of my assets are being irrevocably transferred to the Meadowbrook Foundation. I've purchased a modest cottage where I'll be living. The comparison you're drawing doesn't reflect reality. Richard's eyes narrowed at the mention of the cottage. You've already purchased another home? Without discussing it with me? Yes, I confirmed calmly. Just as you've been discussing renovations to Oakridge with architects without consulting me. A tense silence followed this exchange. The mediator intervened smoothly. Let's focus on the financial arrangements rather than past grievances. Dr. Harrington, what specifically would you consider a fair settlement? Richard glanced at his attorney, then leaned forward with practiced sincerity. I'm not looking to be difficult. I understand Veronica's desire to leave a legacy, especially given her health challenges, but 32 years of marriage should count for something. I'm proposing joint ownership of the Vermont property, an increased monthly stipend of $12,000, and a one-time settlement of $2 million from the family trust. That's not possible, Sylvia responded immediately. The family trust has specific limitations on distributions, and a settlement of that magnitude would compromise its ability to generate the monthly stipend Dr. Harrington is seeking. Additionally, joint ownership of the Vermont property would create ongoing entanglements that my client is specifically seeking to avoid. The mediation continued in this vein for nearly 2 hours. Offers and counteroffers, legal arguments about entitlement versus generosity, thinly veiled references to Richard's behavior and my decision-making capacity. Throughout, I maintained a calm composure, speaking only when directly addressed, refusing to be drawn into emotional exchanges. Finally, during a brief recess, Sylvia pulled me aside. He's not going to be reasonable, she said quietly. His entire strategy is to exhaust you into making concessions. I'm not exhausted, I assured her, and I'm not making further concessions. Then I suggest we present our final position and indicate that if it's not acceptable, we'll proceed without mediation. The legal reality is on our side, even if litigation would be messy and public. When we reconvened, Sylvia presented our final offer. The Vermont property transferred solely to Richard. The monthly stipend increased to $8,000 with cost of living adjustments and a one-time payment of $500,000 to help him establish a new primary residence. This is our final position, she stated firmly. It represents approximately 30% of the total estate value which is generous by any standard for inherited property. If Dr. Harrington finds these terms unacceptable, we'll need to conclude mediation and proceed accordingly. Richard conferred with his attorney in hushed tones, their faces tight with frustration. Finally, Whitmore spoke. We need to consult with financial advisors before responding to this proposal. We request a 1-week adjournment. Granted, the mediator agreed. We'll reconvene next Thursday at the same time. As we gathered our materials to leave, Richard approached me directly, the first time he had done so since our confrontation at Oakridge. Veronica, can we speak privately for a moment? I hesitated, then nodded to Sylvia that it was acceptable. We stepped into a small meeting room adjacent to the conference area. What are you trying to prove? He asked once the door closed behind us, his controlled facade slipping. That you don't need me? That you can punish me for one overheard comment, made during a moment of frustration? I'm not trying to prove anything, I replied evenly. I'm making decisions about my life and my legacy based on what matters to me, not on what you think I should want or need. This isn't you, he insisted. The Veronica I know wouldn't make such dramatic, irrevocable decisions. You've always been measured, practical. Perhaps you never really knew me, I suggested. Or perhaps facing mortality has clarified what matters. Either way, this is who I am now. Someone who won't accept being called a burden, who won't play a supporting role in her own life story. He stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In some ways, I suppose he was. Your prognosis has improved, he said, his voice lower. Dr. Abernathy told me, we could have years, decades even. Isn't that worth reconsidering all of this? That's precisely why I'm not reconsidering, I explained. Because whatever time I have, whether it's months or decades, I want to spend it authentically, not returning to a marriage where I'm valued primarily for what I provide rather than who I am. His expression hardened. You've changed. Yes, I agreed simply. That's what growth looks like. I left him standing there, rejoining Sylvia in the hallway. As we walked to our cars, she asked, Do you think he'll accept the offer? Eventually, I predicted. Richard has always been practical when backed into a corner. He'll calculate the costs of fighting versus settling and make the expedient choice. And if he doesn't? I smiled slightly. Then he'll discover I've become even more determined than he remembers. That evening, Catherine Morgan called to inform me that her foundation's board had unanimously approved the matching fund for the Calloway Center. The paperwork will be ready next week, she announced cheerfully. Once signed, we can make a joint public announcement about the partnership. That's wonderful timing, I told her, explaining the ongoing mediation with Richard. A public announcement might help clarify for Richard that this is happening regardless of his feelings about it. Precisely my thought. Catherine agreed with undisguised satisfaction. Men like Richard respond to public perception. Once the announcement appears in the Westmore Herald and the medical community newsletter, contesting your decision would make him appear petty and obstructionist. After hanging up, I joined Caroline on her porch for our evening ritual of watching the sunset over the lake. The sky was particularly spectacular. Bands of crimson and gold stretched across the horizon, reflected perfectly in the still water. Below, You seem peaceful, Caroline observed, handing me a glass of wine. Despite the contentious mediation, I am, I realized with some surprise. The outcome matters less than it once did. Whether Richard accepts the terms or fights them, I know what my path forward looks like. That certainty is liberating. The following morning brought another unexpected development. Lucas, Caroline's son and my godson, arrived for a surprise visit. At 38, he was a successful architect specializing in historically sensitive renovations, precisely the expertise that would be valuable for Oakridge's transformation. Over breakfast, I described the Meadowbrook Foundation's preliminary, Plans for converting the manor into research facilities while preserving its historical character. That's fascinating, Lucas said, genuinely interested. It's exactly the kind of adaptive reuse project I find most meaningful. Taking a structure designed for one purpose and thoughtfully updating it to serve contemporary needs while honoring its heritage. An idea formed in my mind. Would you be interested in consulting on the project? Dr. Chen is assembling an advisory team, and someone with your perspective would be invaluable. His face lit up. I'd love to be involved, especially given what Oakridge means to you and by extension to Mom and me. We've spent so many holidays and special occasions there. Wonderful, I said, pleased by this unexpected connection between my past and future. I'll introduce you to Dr. Chen next week. Later that day, as Lucas and Caroline caught up, I walked alone along the lake shore, following the path that led toward my soon-to-be cottage. The closing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, another piece of my new life falling into place. As I approached the property, I noticed a car parked in the driveway, Richard's silver Mercedes. He was standing on the cottage's small porch, looking out over the water. He turned as he heard my footsteps on the gravel path. "How did you find me?" I asked, stopping a few feet away. "Edward golfs with the real estate agent who handled the sale," he admitted. "Word gets around." "Why are you here?" He gestured to the cottage. "I wanted to see where you're going, what you're choosing over our life together." I studied him, the man I had shared 3 decades with, whose ambitions I had supported, whose life I had helped build. There was genuine bewilderment in his expression, an inability to comprehend why I would choose this modest home over the status and comfort Oakridge represented. "It's not about the house," I said gently. "It's about who I am in it." At Oakridge, I gradually became invisible, even to myself. Here, I have the chance to rediscover who I am without the weight of others' expectations. And our marriage? 32 years just discarded? Not discarded, I corrected. Completed. We shared a chapter that's now ending. That doesn't diminish what was genuine within it. He looked away, gazing across the lake. "I keep thinking you'll change your mind. That this is some phase triggered, by your diagnosis, a temporary rebellion that will pass." "It's not," I said simply. "This is who I am now. Who I perhaps always was beneath the accommodating exterior. Cancer didn't change me. It revealed me." We stood in silence for a long moment, the space between us filled with unspoken recognitions. Finally, Richard sighed deeply. "I'll accept the terms," he said, his voice resigned. "The Vermont property, the monthly stipend, the settlement. Fighting would be undignified." Relief washed through me, not because I had feared the legal battle, but because this cleared the path for a cleaner separation, a more graceful transition for us both. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "I think that's wise." He turned to leave, then paused. "Is it true what Edward heard? That the Morgan Foundation is partnering on the research center?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Catherine Morgan is establishing a matching fund. The announcement will be made next week." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, that what I had set in motion was larger and more significant than he had initially understood. That I was not merely being impulsive or vindictive, but strategic and purposeful. "You've become quite the philanthropist," he observed, a complicated mix of admiration and resentment in his tone. "I've become myself," I corrected gently. The rest followed naturally. As I watched him drive away, I felt no triumph or satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that this resolution, though painful, was necessary for us both. Richard would adapt, as he always had. His practical nature would eventually accept what couldn't be changed, and he would craft a new narrative that preserved his dignity. And I would continue building the life I had only recently realized I wanted, a life defined by purpose, authenticity, and the freedom to determine my own value and contribution. Autumn painted Mirror Lake in spectacular hues of crimson and gold, the trees surrounding my cottage reflecting perfectly in the still. Water each morning? 3 months had passed since I'd moved in. 3 months of profound transformation, both in my circumstances and within myself. The cottage had become truly mine, not through elaborate renovations or expensive furnishings, but through the selective inclusion of what mattered most. My grandmother's writing desk sat beneath the window overlooking the lake. Shelves held the books that had shaped my intellectual journey. The walls displayed a carefully curated collection of art, each piece chosen for personal significance, rather than investment value or decorative coordination. More importantly, the rhythms of daily life had shifted. I woke each morning without an alarm, made a single cup of coffee in a handcrafted mug purchased from a local artisan, and spent the early hours reading or writing on the small deck. 3 days each week, I drove to Meadowbrook for treatment and advisory board meetings. 2 afternoons were dedicated to writing the book on female Gothic novelists I'd deferred for decades. Evenings often brought dinner with Caroline or visits from Lucas, who had become deeply involved in planning Oakridge's transformation. The settlement with Richard had been finalized without further drama. After our conversation at the cottage, he had signed the mediation agreement, accepting the terms Sylvia and I had proposed. We occasionally exchanged necessary communications, mostly regarding financial matters or mutual acquaintances, but otherwise maintained a respectful distance. I heard through university colleagues that he had purchased a sleek, modern condominium in the city, closer to the hospital and his practice. The Vermont property remained unused, at least for now. Today marked a significant milestone: the official announcement and groundbreaking ceremony for the Calloway Center for Women's Cancer Research. The event would bring together Meadowbrook leadership, the Morgan Foundation, local dignitaries, and members of the medical community, including, inevitably, Richard in his capacity as a hospital board member. I dressed carefully in a tailored pantsuit in deep aubergine, a color I'd never worn during my marriage, when I'd tended toward the muted blues and grays Richard preferred. Catherine Morgan had insisted on sending her personal stylist to help prepare me for the event, recognizing its importance not just for the foundations but for my personal narrative. First impressions of the new you matter, she'd advised pragmatically. This will be many people's introduction to Veronica Harrington as philanthropist and visionary, not just Richard's wife or a cancer patient. Caroline arrived to drive us to Oakridge, elegant in a charcoal dress with a vibrant scarf, her signature accessory. "Ready for your debut?" she asked with a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, gathering my prepared remarks and the small velvet box containing my mother's pearl earrings, my own good luck charm for the day. The drive to Oakridge felt surreal, retracing a familiar route toward a destination that was both intimately known and newly foreign. As we approached the estate, I saw the transformation already beginning. The grounds had been meticulously maintained, but subtle changes heralded its institutional future. Discreet signage indicating parking areas, newly graveled paths to accommodate, increased foot traffic, landscape lighting installed along the main walkways. A large white tent had been erected on the main lawn, with rows of chairs facing a small stage. Behind it, the manor stood as it had for generations, its Victorian grandeur unchanged despite its impending conversion. Workers were unloading equipment, caterers arranging refreshment tables, and foundation staff placing programs on each seat. Dr. Chen spotted us immediately, hurrying over with warm greetings. "Veronica, everything looks wonderful. The architectural renderings are displayed in the main hall, and the press has already started arriving." I followed her inside, where Oakridge's formal rooms had been transformed into exhibition spaces. Each room highlighted a different aspect of the planned research center: the laboratories that would occupy the new buildings, the clinical trial facilities, the education and outreach programs. What struck me most was how seamlessly the plans integrated modern scientific requirements with the property's historical character. "Lucas has done remarkable work," I said, admiring the detailed models showing how new structures would complement rather than compete with the original architecture. "He's been invaluable," Dr. Chen agreed. "His understanding of both the property's heritage and our functional needs has helped us avoid numerous potential conflicts." As guests began arriving, I stationed myself near the entrance alongside Catherine. Morgan, greeting attendees and accepting their congratulations. Many were former colleagues from the university, others were hospital board members who had known me primarily as Richard's wife. Their surprise at seeing me in this new role, donor, visionary, partner to Catherine Morgan, was sometimes barely concealed behind polite compliments. "Veronica, you look radiant," said Elizabeth Winters, the hospital's chief of surgery. "And what you're doing here is truly inspirational. Richard always said you had a brilliant mind, but I had no idea you were interested in medical philanthropy." "It's a recent development," I replied smoothly. "Cancer has a way of clarifying one's priorities." When Richard arrived, precisely on time as always, a subtle ripple moved through the gathering. He was accompanied by Edward and his wife Patricia. All three dressed in appropriate business attire that managed to convey both respect for the occasion and emotional distance from it. Richard nodded to me across the room, a civil acknowledgement that neither invited nor rebuffed further interaction. As the ceremony began, I took my place beside Catherine and Dr. Chen on the small stage. The audience filled every chair, with hospital staff, researchers, and local media crowding the tent. Dr. Abernathy sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of how far my journey had come since that first devastating diagnosis in his office. Dr. Chen spoke first, outlining the Calloway Center's mission and research priorities. Her presentation was both technically precise and emotionally compelling, connecting statistical outcomes with the human impact of early cancer detection. Catherine followed, explaining the Morgan Foundation's commitment to matching funds and how the partnership would accelerate progress toward clinical applications. Then it was my turn. As I approached the podium, a momentary wave of uncertainty washed over me. Public speaking had never been my favorite aspect of academic life, and this audience included not just strangers, but people who had known me in very different contexts, many of whom were still processing the changes in my life circumstances. Took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and began. "Oakridge Manor has stood on this site for over 120 years, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "For 4 generations, it has been a Calloway family home, a place of gatherings, celebrations, quiet evenings, and meaningful conversations. Today, it begins a new chapter, one that honors that history while looking toward a future of scientific discovery and healing." I explained how my own cancer diagnosis had revealed both the progress and limitations of current detection methods, and how the Calloway Center would focus on developing technologies that could identify cancers at their earliest, most treatable stages. "When faced with mortality," I continued, "we all must consider what legacy we wish to leave. For me, transforming this beloved family home into a place of hope and scientific advancement represents the highest purpose I could imagine for both. The property and whatever time I have remaining, whether that's months or decades." I glanced briefly at Richard, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "Cancer changes everything, not just for patients, but for those who love them. It strips away pretense, reveals true priorities, and forces difficult but clarifying choices." Many in the audience nodded, recognizing this truth from their own experiences or those of loved ones. The Calloway Center represents my choice to focus not on what cancer has taken from me, but on what it has given. A fierce clarity about what matters and what doesn't. The opportunity to help ensure other women receive diagnoses when treatment is most effective. The chance to transform a personal challenge into a collective solution. As I concluded my remarks, I felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the fractured pieces of recent months had finally cohered into a meaningful whole. The Veronica who had once defined herself primarily through others' expectations and needs had been replaced by someone both stronger and more authentic. After the formal ceremony, Catherine, Dr. Chen, and I used ceremonial shovels to break ground, where the new research building would stand. Photographs were taken, applause offered, champagne toasts made. Throughout the reception that followed, I moved through Oakridge's rooms with a strange dual awareness, remembering intimate family moments in spaces that were already transitioning to public, institutional purposes. In the library, now designated to become a conference center, I found Richard standing alone, examining the architectural renderings. "Lucas has done excellent work," he commented as I approached. The designs managed to be both practical and respectful of the property's character. "Yes," I agreed. "He understands what matters about this place." An awkward silence followed, laden with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Richard spoke again. "You've accomplished something significant here, Veronica. Whatever our personal differences, I respect what you're creating." "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciative of his acknowledgement. "That means something to me." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "You seem transformed. Not just physically, though you look remarkably well, but fundamentally. I barely recognize the woman I was married to for 3 decades. She's still here," I replied thoughtfully. "Just no longer defined by others' expectations or limitations." "I never meant to limit you," he said, a rare vulnerability in his voice. "Perhaps, not consciously," I acknowledged. "But we both fell into patterns that gradually diminished me. Cancer simply made those patterns impossible to ignore or accept any longer." He nodded slowly, accepting this truth without further defense. "Well, whatever the catalyst, you've created something meaningful here. Your mother would be proud." It was perhaps the most genuine thing he had said to me in months, an acknowledgement of my heritage and my choices that asked nothing in return. I accepted it as the peace offering it appeared to be. "I hope so," I replied simply. As the event concluded and guests departed, I found myself standing on Oakridge's wide front porch with Caroline, watching the autumn sun cast long shadows across the lawn. Soon construction would begin, transforming portions of the grounds I had tended so carefully over the years. The rose gardens would remain, incorporated into healing spaces for patients participating in clinical trials. The ancient oak tree, namesake of the property, would continue its silent witness to human endeavors beneath its spreading branches. "How does it feel?" Caroline asked gently. "Seeing it become something new?" I considered her question, searching for the precise emotional truth. "Like watching a beloved child grow into independence," I finally said. "There's loss in the transformation, but also pride and satisfaction in seeing potential fulfilled." "And your own transformation?" she pressed. "How does that feel?" I smiled, recognizing the deeper question she was asking. "Like finally becoming who I was meant to be all along. Not despite cancer and betrayal, but perhaps because of them. They stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only what matters most." That evening, back at my cottage, I sat on the deck watching moonlight shimmer across the lake. My phone had been filled with congratulatory messages all day. From Lucas, from former students, from Sylvia, from Catherine, from medical colleagues, impressed by the scope of the new center. One final message arrived as I prepared for bed, from Dr. Abernathy. "Remarkable ceremony today. Even more remarkable progress on your latest scans. Continued significant reduction in tumor size. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled at the coincidental timing of his update. Was it the experimental protocol showing continued success? Or was there something to be said for the healing power of reclaiming one's agency, of living authentically even in the face of illness? Perhaps it was both, the medicine and the meaning working in tandem, each reinforcing the other's effectiveness. In my journal that night, I wrote, "Today, Oakridge officially began its transformation into the Calloway Center, a physical manifestation of my own internal journey these past months. What began with Richard's casual cruelty and my cancer diagnosis has culminated in something I never could have imagined, not just a research center that may help countless women, but a reclamation of my essential self." When Richard called me a burden during my illness, he never imagined his words would catalyze such profound change. He thought he was merely expressing frustration to his brother. Instead, he ignited a revolution, not against him specifically, but against all the ways I had gradually allowed myself to be diminished. The estate he assumed he would inherit will now serve a purpose neither of us could have foreseen. My life, which he had begun mentally arranging after my presumed death, has taken a direction entirely of my own choosing. And most surprisingly, I find myself grateful for the painful catalyst that set everything in motion. Cancer and betrayal, twin specters that might have defined my final chapter, have instead become merely the opening lines of a new story entirely. One where I am not patient or victim or dutiful wife, but author and architect of whatever time remains. Tonight, watching the moon's reflection fracture and reform on the lake's surface, I understand something essential. We are never actually trapped by circumstance, only by our belief that we are powerless to change it. The moment we reclaim our agency, however reduced by illness or age or others' expectations, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. What Richard never understood, what I myself had forgotten until forced to remember, was this: I am not defined by what happens to me, but by what I choose to do about it. He called me a burden after my diagnosis, so I donated the estate to someone else. And in doing so, found myself again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.